Assalamu alaikum. I pray you're well, inshallah. And today I've got something a little bit different here in Ihsan Cast. We've got a book review, this book review, in fact, of Shaykh Asrar Rashid, Islam Answers Atheism, which is a recently released book, and what I think is a really great introduction into the topic, and generally a very, very well done book. And inshallah, this is going to be a part of a two-part series with myself and Sheikh Asrar. So today I'm going to do a short book review, and then the next full-length podcast will be with the author himself, Sheikh Asrar Rashid, and hopefully we'll be able to go through the book in a bit more detail and get his views on things, as well as kind of look at few more of the more intricate parts of the book and try and flesh them out for potential readers and of course the listeners of the podcast. So let's begin, inshallah. And the Sheikh begins by basically advising on the importance of someone studying the creed, and really advises on the fact that people need to understand the main tenets of their faith and what are some of the dangers of blind conformity in the faith, one of which, of course, the most important one being that it may lead to a person not gaining salvation. But the author then moves on from that to start to describe rationality and the fact that rationality is used when people are reading the Quran and the Hadith to come to the conclusion that God exists. In fact, the fact is that people use their mind all the time to make normative judgments and statements, showing that they do actually make moral judgments. So the author then goes on to advise that one of the core purposes of kalam is in actual fact to ensure that erroneous concepts such as, for instance, God being in a particular direction are challenged and dismantled in order for the people's faith to be sound. So almost it can be used as a protective measure, and that's one of the main aims of kalam, is a protective measure to make sure that the people's faith is sound. But the author, I think, really interestingly in chapter 1, uh, adds an insight, I think, from his experience of debating atheists and discussing. He's mentioned in the introduction is numerous hours of debating and having conversations with atheists regarding a lot of the logical fallacies that they fall into, such as hasty generalizations, the straw man arguments, taking verses out of context by not reading the pretext or the post-text of the verses in the Quran. And I think that was a really nice discussion to be having, because he really draws on his experience and provides an insight into basically the outlook and the mindset of the atheists, but also what traps they fall into themselves, which I thought was great. Now we head into chapter 2, which is really the crux of the book. The reason why is because it's discussing the epistemology, the kalam epistemology that he will use. Why is this so important? Why is this chapter so important? Is because of the fact that this is the methodology that will be used when he goes on to prove the existence of God, when he goes on to talk about theodicies and the problem of evil, when he goes on to talk about science and Islam, when he goes on to talk about Islamic law. This is the methodology that he's going to be implementing when he is going to be answering such questions that atheists have asked him, but also have generally been trying to critique Islam on. So I think it's an absolutely imperative chapter, and inshallah in the podcast we hope to actually go through this chapter in a bit more detail to flesh it out a bit more, to give people a bit more of understanding of it. But what it allows a person to do is to understand what can and cannot be known, which is crucial when it comes to justifiable belief. And the author then kind of discusses the different types of judgments, and in particular why rational judgments based upon possible, impossible, and necessary cannot be falsified in the same way as things such as empirical judgments. And the author then also explains different types of proofs that can impart certainty. And I think this is really important in relation to ideas such as mass transmission, but also in relation to rational propositions such as logical syllogisms. And I think this is where it then links up nicely with chapter 3, where he then gives the Kalam cosmological argument and the contingency argument in logical syllogism forms. So this is kind of the build up of that and the explanation as to how the rest of the chapters are going to be laid out, really. So it's a really, really important chapter on this. But also what I thought was fantastic about this chapter was when the author looks at the Anglo-European philosophy, and I thought this was brilliant, because okay, he's given the Kalam epistemology, the methodology that we use to identify truths, to identify what's rational, what's possible, what's impossible, and what's necessary. But also, I mean, this is an insight into what the Anglo-European philosophy is like and how do they come up with conclusions. I think this was so important because we see these thoughts and ideas being echoed by new atheists all the time. For instance, when Sam Harris in his book The Moral Landscape talks about trying to create objective morality, we basically see that it is the same type of utilitarianism that was advocated by John Stuart Mill and his student Jeremy Bentham. And we'll see that Harris, will argue that, morality is all about improving the well-being of creatures. And since science can provide us facts about the well-being of creatures, science can tell us what is objectively moral, i.e., what is right and what is wrong. Now, this is in sense saying that science can tell you how you ought to behave, which is completely absurd because science this is under the remit of moral philosophy. It doesn't actually come under the remit of science at all. So, for instance, he will say, well, we should do, whatever benefits, for instance, 70% of people or 80% of people, and well, the 20% of people that suffer because of this, well, they're almost collateral damage, and that's fine. But we saw the negative impacts of that, the extreme negative impacts of that type of utilitarianism, for instance, in Stalin's Russia. So I thought that part was great. It was really, really great because what a reader could do is they could compare and contrast the two types of methodologies laid out, but also get an insight into exactly where these underlying themes of people like Harris and people like Dawkins and Daniel Dennett and Christopher Hitchens, where they're getting their ideas from, what methodology they're using, and ultimately what processes they're using, and what traps they're really falling into as well by using the methodology that these new atheists use, and what kind of world they would want to live in as well. I think that's an important point. And chapter 3 then goes into the proofs of God's existence using the traditional Kalam cosmological argument, as well as other arguments of cosmological arguments. The contingency argument as well are mentioned here. And the author again sticks to the methodology of Kalam. He uses logic to back up, and when he's writing down the syllogisms, he uses his methodology, in particular Montic logic, to defend those syllogisms. Extremely well done, I thought personally. And then he also, after that, first and foremost, he uses the Kalam methodology of using Montic and discusses things like the impossibility of an actual infinite occurring, typical kind of arguments used, for instance, by the great Imam al-Ghazali and others to defend this argument. And of course, the Kalam cosmological argument is an extremely strong argument, and this form that he's actually given is a classical version, which is almost watertight. And he then also explains the fact that the way he's explained it and the way he's the logical method that he's used, these arguments won't fall into the traps of circular reasoning and continuous regression. But then he'll also give explanations of the fact, the Big Bang theory, what Sir Roger Penrose has to say, what Stephen Hawking has to say, etc., about all of this. So, he backs up uh, the fact that the universe has a beginning from a logical perspective using kalam methodology, but he also brings in what science has to say as well, just as an almost as a backup for that, which I thought was great as well. And then he also explains other proofs such as the teleological arguments and where their potential uses are, but also where their potential pitfalls are. For instance, in the fact that they cannot impart certainty in the same way that the Kalam cosmological argument can, which again I thought was very well done. And chapter 4, then, inshallah, the author then looks at the logical problem of evil syllogism, which is on page 52 of the book, and then tackles it really by showing how it is actually its claims are logically inconsistent. And then the author also provides a thorough overview of the free will defense, as well as some theodicies into why evil occurs in our world. And inshallah, I'm not going to be covering too much of that. Obviously, we've had a previous podcast on the problem of evil, but also, inshallah, this is something which I do want to pick up with the Sheikh in the podcast on. The author also explains, the fact that Sunni Muslims believe um, it is God that decides what is good and bad, and that Allah is the objective lawgiver that one follows, as humans ultimately are subjective in their thinking. And I think this is a really important point to mention because he now brings in the morality and moral arguments into it, which is, you know, a very very important point to bring in, because of the fact that people are thinking about God, people are questioning God. There are many agnostics out there, and I think this is a really really good part of the book for those people to read, as well as generally Muslims. Theodicies explained here, and why does evil occur in our world. um, I think this is a really really important part for Muslims to read. I mean, for instance, just the practical nature of it, the fact that COVID-19 has maybe created many doubts in people's minds, but why did God allow such evil things to happen? So even just for the average person, this is a really useful chapter for them. And then chapter 5 relates to Islam and science. And the author then discusses how the Quran is not really a book of science, so to speak. And its main purpose isn't that it's a book of science, and clarifies criticisms that atheists have made about the Quran and Hadith uh, being scientifically incorrect. And then I think he comes to a bit of a juicy part, which is the discourse regarding Islam and evolution. And the author will then advise the fact that Darwinian evolution is an interpretation as the best explanation of the fossil records available, and it is by no means the only explanation given. There are others such as epigenetics, natural selection via genetic drift, natural genetic engineering, which has been formulated and advocated by James Shapiro. So, since the fact that really evolution awaits a paradigm shift, we can't treat it in the same way as we would treat something like gravity or photosynthesis. And because of this, Muslims don't have to actually move away from their position that the first man was fashioned from the earth, as really the theory of evolution at its current point in time does not provide rational certainty. And again, it goes back to the methodology, the Kalam methodology that he advised of in chapter 2, and he's used consistently throughout this book, is the idea of rational certainty. And therefore, unless there's a complete paradigm shift that occurs, and there's overwhelming evidence that imparts certainty, there's no need to accept evolution in its current state. And also, I think an important point to mention is the fact that it is not rationally impossible uh, for God to create human beings ex nihilo. So therefore, this idea of there being a conflict between reason and revelation, I think, anyway, the author would advise that it's not come to that point yet for us to look at. And chapter 6 is, I think, a great chapter just for the general public. I think it's a great chapter just for everyone to read, because these are things which are so-called, contentious parts of Islamic law. The atheists and those who will always try and attack Islam will always use to make their points. If you've watched any of these debates, if you've watched these discussions, you will see that the parts of the book and the discussions and the topics that he's chosen in chapter 6 are exactly the topics which atheists love to pick up on and love to really probe Muslims about. And these are things like capital punishment for apostates, the marriage of Sayyidina Aisha radiallahu anha to the Prophet sallallahu the hijab are all discussed and their wisdom explained. What I really liked about this part was the fact that the author Shaykh Asrar actually looks at these issues from all various angles. And for instance, I'll give you an example of that. When he's discussing the the marriage of the Prophet ﷺ to Sayyidina Aisha radiallahu anha, he look at it from explaining the cultural norms of the time. He look at analyzing the hadith narrations. He'll also look at evidences given from Islamic historians to show that, for instance, Sayyidina Aisha radiallahu anha was much older than what was being claimed by the atheists as to when the marriage took place. So I really liked how he approached it from all these different angles to give it a really well-rounded position and a really well-rounded answer to these statements. And like I said, I think one of the real benefits of chapters 5 and in particular 6 is the fact that it really gives this book immense readability, but also something that individuals can go back to. So if you are an individual, if you're a person who's, for instance, not a specialist in kalam or by any stretch of the imagination, but you're just a member of the general public, and you hear something like, oh, why do you wear the hijab, or the hijab is oppressive, or capital punishment or penal punishments in Islam, why do these horrible things happen, etc. You can, quite easily go through this book, pick up, inshallah, the discussion and read the full discussion and get a really solid and refined explanation and answer to this. And it's by someone who is traditionally trained. Alhamdulillah, Shaykh Asrar is a traditionally trained scholar, and it's going to be a really well-rounded answer that is going to be given as well. So I think it's a great resource. I think it is for everyone. I think it's a wonderful introduction. I think probably it's one of the best introductions that someone can have into this field. I think it reads also very well. The actual book itself is fantastic. It's a hardcover book. It lasts you a long time. Um, and I really do think that it should be something that everyone should read. And even if you're probably thinking it's too complicated or whatever, the Sheikh is inshallah advised. I was listening to the book launch and he was advising that he does plan to run classes on it to explain things, and hopefully the podcast coming up should explain things and flesh things out in a bit more detail as well to help you with the book. But it is definitely I think a great contribution to the Sunni literature. And inshallah, the next podcast that we will be having, which will be up and running, I would think will be up on the channel within the next week, inshallah, will be with Shaykh Asrar Rashid. So please do tune in for that, inshallah. And until then, take care. Assalamu alaikum.